13 years ago, Paul Mitchell, a 43-year-old Pentagon security analyst, disappeared after his evening shift on November 15, 2006, without leaving a trace. His military badge was found in the parking garage, his car keys scattered on the asphalt, but Paul himself had vanished into the cold Virginia night. The disappearance plunged his wife Sarah and their 3 children, Emma, 16, Jake, 14, and little Sophie, just 8, into an abyss of despair and uncertainty that would consume their lives for over a decade. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. Paul Mitchell wasn't just another missing person statistic. He was a decorated Army veteran with 18 years of distinguished service, a man who had survived 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to vanish without explanation in what should have been the safety of his homeland. His disappearance sent shockwaves through the Pentagon's tight-knit security community and left his suburban Arlington family shattered. The initial investigation seemed promising. Paul's supervisor, Colonel David Harrison, told investigators that Paul had completed his shift normally at 11:47 p.m., reviewing classified intelligence reports as he had done for the past 4 years. Security cameras captured him walking through the Pentagon's corridors at 11:52 p.m., his familiar stride confident and purposeful. But at 12:03 a.m., the cameras lost him in the parking structure's blind spot, and Paul Mitchell simply ceased to exist. Sarah Mitchell, an elementary school teacher, became a woman possessed by grief and determination. Paul would never just leave, she told Detective Martinez during those first desperate weeks. He kissed Sophie goodnight every single day. He was coaching Jake's baseball team. He was planning Emma's Sweet 16. Men don't abandon their entire world without a word. Her voice, steady despite the tears, carried the weight of absolute certainty that something terrible had happened to her husband. The Arlington Police Department, working with Pentagon security and FBI agents due to Paul's security clearance, initially considered multiple theories. Had Paul been targeted because of his access to classified information? Was this a foreign intelligence operation? Could he have been suffering from PTSD that his family didn't recognize? Or worse, had someone close to him orchestrated his disappearance? Detective Sarah Martinez, a 15-year veteran of the force, took the case personally. She interviewed everyone in Paul's life, his Pentagon colleagues who described him as reliable and well-liked, his neighbors who saw him as the perfect family man, his military buddies who respected his integrity. Every lead seemed to evaporate like morning mist. Paul's bank accounts showed no unusual activity. His cell phone, found smashed in a dumpster 3 miles from the Pentagon, revealed nothing. His computer history showed only routine emails and family photos. As weeks turned to months, the investigation began to slow. The FBI gradually reduced their involvement as national security concerns were ruled out. The Arlington police continued their work, but with diminishing resources and growing caseloads, Paul Mitchell's file began gathering dust. By Christmas 2007, exactly 1 year after Paul's disappearance, the case was unofficially considered cold. But Sarah Mitchell refused to let her husband become another forgotten statistic. She organized search parties that scoured the Virginia countryside. She hired private investigators with the family's savings. She appeared on local news shows, pleading for information, holding up Paul's photograph with trembling hands. "Someone knows something," she would say, her voice breaking. "Someone saw something. Please just tell me what happened to my husband." The children struggled to understand why their father had vanished. Emma, once an honor student, began failing classes and withdrew from her friends. Jake quit the baseball team his father had coached, unable to bear playing without him in the stands. Little Sophie would sit by the window every evening, waiting for her daddy to come home, her small face pressed against the cold glass, breath fogging the window as she whispered, "Come home, Daddy. Please come home." As 2008 dawned, the Mitchell family faced a devastating reality. Paul was gone, and no one seemed capable of bringing him back. The years following Paul Mitchell's disappearance were marked by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the family whole. From 2007 to 2018, the case file collected dust in the Arlington Police Department's cold case archives, while the Mitchell family lived in a perpetual state of suspended animation, caught between hope and despair, never able to truly grieve or move forward. Detective Sarah Martinez, now a lieutenant, never forgot Paul's case. Every few months she would pull the file from storage, spread the evidence across her desk, and stare at the photographs of the man who had simply vanished. The security footage, grainy and inconclusive, the scattered car keys, the smashed cell phone, the military badge that seemed almost deliberately placed. Something about the case haunted her, a nagging feeling that the answer was hiding in plain sight. Sarah Mitchell aged a decade in those silent years. The vibrant elementary school teacher who had once filled her classroom with laughter became a hollow-eyed woman driven by a single purpose: finding her husband. She kept his home office exactly as he left it, his coffee mug still sitting on the desk, his reading glasses folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. Friends and family gently suggested she needed to move on and think about the children, but Sarah's response was always the same: "Paul is still out there, I can feel it." The children grew up in the shadow of their father's absence. Emma graduated high school in 2009, but instead of celebrating, the family held a vigil on what would have been Paul's 46th birthday. She chose to attend community college nearby, unable to bear the thought of leaving her mother alone. Jake, once outgoing and athletic, became quiet and introspective, channeling his confusion into academic achievement. By 2014, he had earned a full scholarship to Georgetown University, studying criminal justice, perhaps hoping to one day solve his father's disappearance himself. Sophie, who had been only 8 when her father vanished, struggled most of all. She had few concrete memories of Paul, just fragments: his deep voice reading bedtime stories, strong hands pushing her on the swing set, the scratch of his military uniform when he hugged her. As she entered her teenage years, Sophie began to rebel against the ghost that dominated their household. "Maybe he just left us," she would scream during family arguments. "Maybe he didn't want to be our father anymore." These outbursts would send Sarah into sobbing fits that lasted for hours. The Pentagon, meanwhile, had moved on. Paul's security clearance was officially revoked in 2008, and his position was filled by another analyst. His former colleagues occasionally mentioned him in hushed conversations, but as new crises emerged and personnel changed, Paul Mitchell became another cautionary tale whispered in break rooms, the reliable family man who had simply walked away from everything. In 2012, 6 years after Paul's disappearance, a private investigator named Marcus Chen approached Sarah with what seemed like a breakthrough. He claimed to have identified a pattern of similar disappearances involving military personnel with high-security clearances. For $10,000, he promised to uncover the truth about Paul's fate. Sarah, desperate and financially strained from years of private investigation fees, borrowed against the house to pay Chen's fee. 3 months later, Chen disappeared with the money, leaving behind only vague promises and fabricated documents. The betrayal nearly broke Sarah completely. She spent weeks in bed, unable to eat or sleep, while Emma took time off from her job to care for Sophie and manage the household. It was during this dark period that Sarah seriously considered giving up for the first time. Perhaps everyone was right. Perhaps she needed to accept that Paul was gone and would never be coming back. But in 2015, on the 9th anniversary of Paul's disappearance, something unexpected happened. Sophie, now 17 and a senior in high school, made a presentation for her sociology class about families affected by unsolved crimes. She interviewed her mother, her siblings, and several of her father's former Pentagon colleagues. The presentation, which she titled "The Ripple Effect: How One Man's Disappearance Changed Everything," won first place in a statewide competition. More importantly, Sophie's research had uncovered something interesting. Paul's Pentagon supervisor, Colonel David Harrison, had left the military abruptly in 2007, just 6 months after Paul's disappearance. He had relocated to Colorado and severed all contact with his former colleagues. Sarah had never known this detail. Somehow it had never made it into the police reports. When Sarah called Lieutenant Martinez with this information, she could hear the excitement in the detective's voice. "Sarah, this is the first new lead we've had in 8 years. Let me make some calls." But even this potential breakthrough led nowhere. Colonel Harrison, now working as a private security consultant in Denver, cooperated fully with a phone interview. He remembered Paul as a dedicated employee and expressed genuine sadness about his disappearance. He explained that his own departure from the military had been planned for years and was unrelated to Paul's case. His alibi for the night of November 15, 2006 was solid. He had been at his daughter's wedding in Philadelphia with hundreds of witnesses. As 2018 arrived, marking 12 years since Paul's disappearance, The Mitchell family had reached a kind of exhausted equilibrium. Emma, now 28, had married a kind man named David who understood her family's situation. Jake, 26, had become a prosecutor in the D.C. area, driven by a passion for justice that everyone understood stemmed from his father's case. Sophie, 20, was studying psychology at Virginia Tech, fascinated by trauma and its long-term effects on families. Sarah, now 47, continued her lonely vigil, but the fire that had once consumed her had dimmed to glowing embers. She still appeared on the anniversary news segments that local stations ran every November 15th, but her pleas for information had taken on a ritualistic quality, like prayers offered without expectation of divine intervention. None of them could have imagined that in less than a year, everything would change. March 23, 2019, began like any ordinary Saturday for the Mitchell family. Sarah was grading papers at the kitchen table, the same spot where she had waited countless nights for Paul to call, to walk through the door, to somehow return to their shattered world. Emma was visiting with her 2-year-old daughter, Grace, who was playing with blocks in the living room, the same room where Paul used to read bedtime stories. The house carried the weight of 13 years of unresolved grief, but life, somehow, continued. At 2:47 p.m., Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Arlington Police Department, and Sarah's heart began the familiar acceleration that accompanied any call from law enforcement. Over the years, she had learned to temper her expectations. Usually these calls brought nothing but disappointment, false leads, mistaken identities, or simply routine updates on the permanently stalled investigation. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez's voice sounded different this time, charged with an energy that Sarah hadn't heard in years. "Sarah, I need you to sit down. We may have found something significant." The discovery had begun 3 days earlier, when construction workers breaking ground for a new shopping complex in Fairfax County, about 15 miles from the Pentagon, had unearthed something that made them immediately stop work and call the authorities. Buried beneath 4 feet of earth and construction debris, wrapped in what appeared to be military-grade tarpaulin, they had found human remains. The Fairfax County medical examiner, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, had worked on hundreds of cases involving unidentified remains, but something about these bones told a story that demanded urgent attention. The skeleton was that of a male, approximately 40-45 years old at time of death, with evidence of healed fractures consistent with military service. More importantly, forensic analysis revealed that the body had been in the ground for approximately 12 to 13 years. But it was the personal effects found with the remains that had caused Detective Martinez's phone to ring at midnight 3 days ago. A corroded military watch, its face barely readable, but the serial number still visible. A wedding ring with an inscription that read, "Forever yours SM," and most significantly, fragments of what appeared to be a Pentagon security badge, damaged but still partially legible. Dr. Walsh had immediately ordered DNA testing, but the process would take weeks. However, dental records could provide a much faster identification. At 9 a.m. on March 23rd, Paul Mitchell's dental records from his military file were compared with the skull found in Fairfax County. The match was positive. "Sarah," Lieutenant Martinez said gently, "we've found Paul." The words that Sarah had simultaneously dreaded and longed to hear for 13 years hit her like a physical blow. Emma, who had been playing with Grace, immediately moved to her mother's side, recognizing the expression of shock and relief that transformed Sarah's face. For 13 years, Sarah had lived with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether her husband was alive or dead, suffering or at peace, hoping for rescue or beyond all earthly concerns. Now she knew. Paul had never abandoned his family. He had never chosen to disappear. He had never stopped loving them or wanting to come home. He had been murdered and buried like discarded trash in a construction site, but at least, finally, he was no longer lost. The identification process moved quickly once dental records confirmed what everyone suspected. DNA testing, completed 10 days later, provided absolute confirmation. The remains were those of Paul Mitchell. The cause of death, according to Dr. Walsh's preliminary examination, was blunt force trauma to the skull. Paul had been killed by multiple strikes with a heavy object, possibly a baseball bat or crowbar, but the location of the burial site raised immediate questions. The Fairfax County construction site was not a random dumping ground. In 2006, the land had been privately owned by Fairfax Development Corporation, a small company specializing in commercial real estate. Access to the property would have required either breaking through a security fence or having legitimate business there. Detective Martinez, energized by the first real break in the case since 2006, began pulling property records, business licenses, and employment records for Fairfax Development Corporation. The company had gone bankrupt in 2010, and most of its employees had scattered to other jobs, but the paper trail still existed. As she worked through the files late into the evening of March 25th, Martinez discovered something that made her pulse quicken. In November 2006, Fairfax Development Corporation had employed a night security guard named Thomas Bradley, a former military police officer who had served in the same unit as Paul Mitchell during their deployment to Iraq in 2003. The two men had known each other. They had served together, lived in the same barracks, perhaps even saved each other's lives in combat. And in November 2006, Thomas Bradley had been working night shifts at the very location where Paul's body was discovered 13 years later. Martinez immediately ran Bradley's name through the criminal database. What she found sent chills down her spine. Thomas Bradley had been arrested twice for domestic violence, once in 2008 and again in 2011. Both cases had been dismissed when the victims, his ex-wife and a girlfriend, had refused to testify, claiming they had misunderstood the situation and that Bradley was really a good man who just needed help. But it was Bradley's current address that made Martinez reach for her car keys at 11:30 p.m. on March 25th. He lived just 8 miles from the Pentagon, in the same Arlington neighborhood where Paul Mitchell had disappeared. For 13 years, Paul's killer had been living virtually next door to the family whose lives he had destroyed. As Martinez drove through the quiet suburban streets toward Bradley's address, she couldn't help but wonder how many times the man who had murdered Paul Mitchell had encountered Sarah at the grocery store, at school events, or simply walking through the neighborhood where she had spent 13 years hoping for her husband's return. The truth, as it always does, was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Thomas Bradley lived at 1247 Oakwood Drive, in a modest 2-story colonial that needed paint and yard work. As Lieutenant Martinez sat in her unmarked car at 6:30 a.m. on March 26, 2019, watching the house through the morning mist, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at 13 years of hidden guilt made manifest in peeling shutters and an overgrown lawn. At 7:15 a.m., a man emerged from the house, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and the unmistakable posture of a career military man. Even in civilian clothes, Thomas Bradley moved with the measured precision of someone accustomed to following orders and maintaining discipline. He loaded a lunch cooler into a battered pickup truck and drove away, apparently heading to his current job at a private security firm. Martinez waited 30 minutes, then knocked on the door. It was answered by a woman in her 40s, thin and nervous, with the kind of carefully applied makeup that doesn't quite hide old bruises. She introduced herself as Linda Bradley, Thomas's wife of 6 years. "He's at work," Linda said immediately, as if anticipating trouble. "Whatever this is about, he's at work. He hasn't done anything wrong." Martinez showed her badge and explained that she needed to speak with Thomas about an old case, a missing person investigation from 2006. Linda's face went white. "You should talk to his lawyer," she whispered, then quickly added, "I mean, not that he needs one, but that's just what you're supposed to say, right? When police come asking questions?" The interview with Thomas Bradley took place at Arlington Police Headquarters at 2 p.m. that same day. Martinez had spent the morning researching Bradley's military service record, and what she found painted a troubling picture of a decorated soldier whose career had been derailed by increasing incidents of violence and insubordination. Staff Sergeant Thomas Bradley had served with distinction in Iraq from 2003-2004, earning a Bronze Star for valor during an ambush that had saved the lives of 6 soldiers in his unit, including Sergeant Paul Mitchell. But subsequent deployments had revealed a pattern of escalating aggression. Bradley had been written up multiple times for excessive force during civilian encounters, inappropriate behavior toward female personnel, and conflicts with superior officers. His discharge in 2005 had been officially listed as honorable, but Martinez's contacts at the Pentagon suggested it had been a face-saving measure to avoid a court-martial. Bradley had been struggling with what would now be recognized as severe PTSD, but in 2005, the military's understanding of combat trauma was still limited, and treatment options were minimal. When Bradley walked into the interview room, Martinez was struck by how little he resembled the confident soldier she had seen in his military photographs. At 56, he looked older, worn down by years of what his employment record suggested had been sporadic work and financial instability. His hands shook slightly. Whether from nerves, alcohol withdrawal, or medication, she couldn't tell. "I heard you found Paul," he said before Martinez could even begin her questioning. "Took you long enough." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Martinez had conducted hundreds of interviews, but she had rarely encountered a suspect who seemed almost relieved to be caught. "Tell me about November 15th, 2006, Martinez said quietly. Bradley's story came out in fragments, interrupted by long silences and what appeared to be genuine remorse. He and Paul had maintained contact after their military service ended, meeting occasionally for coffee or beers to reminisce about their time in Iraq. Their friendship had been complicated by Bradley's increasing bitterness about his post-military struggles and Paul's apparent success in transitioning to civilian life. "Paul had everything," Bradley said, his voice thick with old resentment. "Good job, beautiful family, nice house. Me? I was working security for $12 an hour, living in a studio apartment, drinking myself to sleep every night. And he would sit there and tell me how grateful he was, how blessed he felt. Made me sick." On November 15th, 2006, Bradley had called Paul at work, claiming he needed help with a security issue at the construction site where he was working night shifts. Paul, ever the loyal friend and dedicated soldier, had agreed to stop by after his shift ended. "I told him there might be someone stealing equipment, that I needed backup to check it out," Bradley continued. "Paul believed me because he trusted me. We'd saved each other's lives in Iraq. You don't question that kind of bond." But when Paul arrived at the construction site at approximately 12:30 a.m., Bradley had been waiting with a baseball bat and 13 years of accumulated rage. "I didn't plan it," Bradley insisted. Though Martinez noted that he had clearly thought through the logistics of disposal, "I just wanted to confront him, to make him understand what his perfect life was costing me. Every time I saw him happy, it reminded me of everything I'd lost." The confrontation had escalated quickly. Paul, according to Bradley, had tried to calm his friend down, suggesting that Bradley seek counseling through veteran services. This offer of help had been the final trigger for Bradley's explosive violence. "He was trying to fix me," Bradley said, tears streaming down his weathered face, "like I was some kind of broken toy he could repair. I'd saved his life in Fallujah, and he was treating me like a charity case." The first blow had knocked Paul unconscious. The subsequent strikes, Bradley admitted with horrifying clinical detachment, had been intended to ensure there would be no witnesses to his breakdown. Bradley had buried Paul's body using construction equipment that was left on site over the weekend. He had scattered Paul's car keys in the Pentagon parking garage to make it appear that the disappearance had occurred there, then disposed of Paul's cell phone in a dumpster miles away. The military badge, he claimed, had fallen during the struggle and had been accidentally buried with the body. "I watched the news coverage," Bradley said. "I saw his wife begging for information, his kids growing up without their father. Every day for 13 years I wanted to tell someone, but I was too much of a coward." As the interview concluded, Martinez asked the question that had haunted her since the case began. "Why didn't you just call for help? Paul would have understood what you were going through." Bradley's answer encapsulated the tragedy that had destroyed 2 families and left 3 children fatherless. "Because asking for help felt like admitting I was weaker than the war, and I couldn't handle being weak in front of the man whose life I'd saved." The arrest of Thomas Bradley on March 26, 2019, sent shockwaves through both the Pentagon community and the quiet Arlington neighborhood where Sarah Mitchell had spent 13 years waiting for answers. Within hours, news vans lined Oakwood Drive, and reporters thrust microphones toward anyone willing to comment on the man who had lived among them while carrying the secret of Paul Mitchell's murder. Sarah's first reaction to the news was not relief or satisfaction, but a profound emptiness that surprised even her. For 13 years, she had imagined this moment, the call that would finally explain what had happened to her husband. She had envisioned feeling vindicated, or at peace, or at least capable of moving forward. Instead, she felt hollowed out, as if the purpose that had sustained her for more than a decade had suddenly evaporated. "I thought I would feel different," she told Emma, as they sat in the living room where Paul's photograph still watched over them from the mantelpiece. "I thought knowing the truth would help somehow, But Tom Bradley was Paul's friend. They served together. Paul trusted him enough to meet him in the middle of the night, and Tom just killed him for being happy. The psychological weight of this betrayal, not just of Paul, but of the fundamental bonds that connect soldiers who have shared combat, was almost unbearable for Sarah to process. Paul had died not because he was targeted by strangers or caught in random violence, but because his success and contentment had become unbearable reminders to a troubled friend of everything that war had taken away. Emma, now 29 and a mother herself, struggled to explain to her 2-year-old daughter why Grandma Sarah was crying again, why the house felt heavy with sorrow even though they had finally learned what happened to Grandpa Paul. The truth, rather than providing closure, seemed to have opened new wounds that no one knew how to heal. Jake, the prosecutor who had built his career on seeking justice for victims, found himself uniquely positioned to understand both the legal and emotional complexities of the case. He took leave from his job to be with his family during the media circus that followed Bradley's arrest, but privately, he was grappling with professional questions that kept him awake at night. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to murder, he explained to reporters who asked whether Bradley could face the death penalty. But Virginia law in 2006 was different from today. This case will involve complex legal questions about jurisdiction, evidence preservation, and the reliability of a confession made 13 years after the crime. Sophie, now 21 and studying psychology, became fascinated by the psychological profile that emerged as more details about Bradley's life became public. His ex-wife came forward with stories of escalating domestic violence that had begun shortly after his return from Iraq. Co-workers described a man who had become increasingly paranoid and resentful, convinced that the military and the government had abandoned him despite his service and sacrifice. He's a textbook case of untreated PTSD complicated by survivor guilt, Sophie told a local news reporter, displaying the clinical detachment she had learned to apply to trauma as a coping mechanism. In 2006, we didn't have the resources or understanding to help veterans like Thomas Bradley. In many ways, both my father and his killer were casualties of a system that failed them. This perspective, that Paul and Bradley were both victims of inadequate veteran support services, was not well received by everyone in the community. Some neighbors expressed outrage that anyone would suggest sympathy for Paul's killer, while others argued that thousands of veterans had faced similar struggles without resorting to murder. Lieutenant Martinez, meanwhile, was working to build an airtight case against Bradley. His confession had been recorded and legally obtained, but prosecutors wanted physical evidence to corroborate his story. The baseball bat used to kill Paul had never been found. Bradley claimed he had thrown it in the Potomac River the day after the murder. However, soil samples from Bradley's 2006 residence showed traces of the same clay found at the burial site, and cell phone records from 2006 confirmed that Bradley had called Paul at work on the evening of November 15th. More disturbing evidence emerged when investigators searched Bradley's current home. In a locked box in his basement, they found a collection of newspaper clippings about Paul's disappearance, including every anniversary article and news report from the past 13 years. Bradley had been meticulously documenting the impact of his crime on the Mitchell family, collecting their pain like trophies. The most chilling discovery was a handwritten letter, dated November 15, 2018, exactly 12 years after Paul's murder. In it, Bradley had written, "Sarah, I want you to know that Paul didn't suffer. I want you to know that he talked about you and the kids right up until the end. I want you to know that I'm sorry, but I can't live with this anymore. By the time you read this, I'll be with Paul, and maybe we can both forgive each other." The letter had never been sent. Investigators theorized that Bradley had planned to commit suicide on the anniversary of his crime, but had lost his nerve. Instead, he had locked the letter away with his collection of newspaper clippings, continuing his macabre vigil over the family he had destroyed. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate Bradley's mental state, concluded that he had been suffering from chronic PTSD, major depression, and what she termed moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone commits acts that violate their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Thomas Bradley spent 13 years torturing himself over what he had done, Dr. Foster explained to the court during preliminary hearings. His collection of newspaper articles, his suicide letter, his immediate confession upon arrest. All of these indicate a man who was consumed by guilt and remorse. This doesn't excuse his actions, but it provides context for understanding why he committed this crime and why he was ultimately unable to live with the consequences. As spring turned to summer in 2019, the Mitchell family faced a new reality. They would have to relive Paul's murder in excruciating detail during Bradley's trial. The closure they had hoped for was becoming another form of torment, as lawyers and expert witnesses dissected every aspect of their tragedy for public consumption. But Sarah, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, made a decision that surprised everyone, including her own children. On June 15, 2019, she issued a public statement that would define how she chose to honor her husband's memory. If this case has already gripped you, please hit the like button. It helps Paul's story reach more people. On September 23, 2019, Thomas Bradley stood before Judge Margaret Reynolds in Arlington Circuit Court to enter his plea for the first-degree murder of Paul Mitchell. The courtroom was packed with reporters, Pentagon colleagues who had worked with Paul, members of the veteran community, and 3 generations of the Mitchell family who had waited 13 years for this moment. Bradley, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, looked even more diminished than he had during his arrest 6 months earlier. His attorney, public defender Michael Chen, had spent months trying to negotiate a plea deal that would spare Bradley the death penalty. But prosecutor Amanda Williams, with Jake Mitchell's input as a consulting attorney, had refused any deal that didn't include a full life sentence without the possibility of parole. When Judge Reynolds asked for his plea, Bradley's voice was barely audible. "Guilty, Your Honor, to all charges." The plea meant there would be no lengthy trial, no parade of witnesses forced to relive the trauma of Paul's disappearance, no gruesome reconstruction of the murder for the entertainment of court watchers. But it also meant that Sarah Mitchell would have the opportunity to address her husband's killer directly during the sentencing hearing, a moment she had been simultaneously dreading and anticipating for months. Sarah had spent weeks writing her victim impact statement, filling page after page with 13 years of accumulated grief, rage, and questions that could never be satisfactorily answered. But the night before the hearing, she had thrown away everything she had written and started over with a single sheet of paper. Standing at the podium on October 15, 2019, Sarah looked directly at Thomas Bradley for the first time since his arrest. Her voice was steady, her words carefully chosen. "Tom, Paul saved your life in Iraq. You told the police that, and I believe it's true. But what you need to understand is that Paul continued trying to save your life even after you came home. Every time he met you for coffee, every time he listened to your struggles, every time he offered to help you find resources or counseling, he was still trying to be the soldier who had your back in combat." Bradley, who had stared at his hands throughout most of the proceedings, looked up and met Sarah's eyes. "You killed him because his happiness reminded you of your pain," Sarah continued. "But Paul's happiness wasn't something that happened to him by accident. He worked for it. He went to counseling when he came home from Iraq. He talked to me about his nightmares and his guilt, and his fear that he wasn't the same man who had left for war. He chose to fight for his mental health the same way he had fought for his country and for his fellow soldiers." The courtroom was completely silent except for the quiet sobbing of Linda Bradley, who sat in the back row with her head buried in her hands. "I'm not going to tell you that I forgive you, because I don't. I may never forgive you, but I want you to understand that Paul would have forgiven you. Even knowing how this story ends, Paul would have tried to help you find a way to heal instead of destroying yourself and taking him with you." Sarah's statement lasted only 3 minutes, but its impact reverberated through the courtroom and, later, through the national media coverage of the case. Rather than demanding vengeance or expressing hatred for her husband's killer, she had chosen to honor Paul's memory by trying to break the cycle of violence and guilt that had led to his death. Dr. Foster, who had been observing Bradley throughout the proceedings, noted that Sarah's words had a visible impact on the defendant. For the first time since his arrest, Mr. Bradley appeared to be processing genuine grief rather than self-pity, she wrote in her final psychological evaluation. Mrs. Mitchell's statement seemed to force him to confront not just what he had taken from her family, but what he had deprived himself of by choosing violence over seeking help. Emma Mitchell, speaking on behalf of herself and her siblings, was less forgiving than her mother. Thomas Bradley didn't just kill our father, he stole 13 years of our family's life. He watched us suffer. He watched our mother become a shadow of herself. He watched us grow up without guidance and support. And he said nothing. That level of selfishness and cruelty is unforgivable, regardless of his mental health struggles. Jake, speaking as both a son and a prosecutor, addressed the broader implications of the case. This tragedy illustrates the urgent need for better mental health services for veterans, but it also demonstrates that trauma and mental illness do not excuse murder. Thomas Bradley had numerous opportunities over 13 years to confess, to allow our family to bury our father and begin healing. Instead, he chose to compound his original crime with years of additional cruelty. Sophie, the youngest Mitchell child, offered perhaps the most complex perspective. I've spent 3 years studying trauma and psychology, trying to understand not just what happened to our family, but why. Thomas Bradley represents the failure of multiple systems, military, medical, and social. But ultimately, individuals have to choose whether to seek help or to hurt others. My father chose to seek help after his war experiences. Thomas Bradley chose to commit murder. That choice, not his trauma, defines who he is. Judge Reynolds, before pronouncing sentence, addressed the broader issues raised by the case. This court has heard extensive testimony about post-traumatic stress disorder, about the challenges faced by veterans returning from combat, about the inadequacy of support systems available in 2006. While these factors may explain Mr. Bradley's actions, they do not excuse them. Paul Mitchell faced the same war experiences, the same challenges of reintegration, but he chose to seek help rather than to harm others. The sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Bradley would die in prison, carrying the weight of his crime and its 13-year cover-up to his grave. As the Mitchell family left the courthouse that day, they faced a future that was both familiar and completely foreign. For 13 years, their lives had been defined by the search for Paul and the hope that he might somehow return. Now they knew with certainty that he never would, but they also knew that his killer would spend the rest of his life paying for what he had taken from them. The case had attracted national attention, not just because of its shocking betrayal of military brotherhood, but because of Sarah Mitchell's extraordinary response to her husband's killer. Her victim impact statement was viewed millions of times on social media, and she began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about veteran mental health, victims' rights, and the long-term impact of violent crime on families. But for Sarah, the end of the legal proceedings marked the beginning of a different kind of challenge, learning how to live without the driving purpose that had sustained her for 13 years. For the first time since November 15, 2006, she had to figure out who she was when she wasn't searching for her missing husband. The answer to that question would define the final chapter of this tragic story. 6 months after Thomas Bradley's sentencing, Sarah Mitchell found herself facing a challenge she had never anticipated, learning how to live without the consuming purpose that had defined her existence for 13 years. The search for Paul had given structure to her days, meaning to her suffering, and hope to sustain her through the darkest moments. Now, with Bradley imprisoned for life and Paul's remains finally laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery, Sarah confronted an unexpected emptiness. The funeral had taken place on November 15, 2019, exactly 13 years after Paul's disappearance. The Pentagon had granted full military honors, and hundreds of people attended, including colleagues who had never stopped wondering what had happened to their friend and fellow veteran. Paul's casket, draped in an American flag, was finally surrounded by the family who had never stopped loving him, and the community that had never forgotten his service. But after the 21-gun salute and the presentation of the folded flag, after the last mourner had offered condolences and the last news van had departed, Sarah returned to a house that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. For the first time in over a decade, she wasn't waiting for Paul to come home. Emma, now juggling her own family responsibilities with concern for her mother, began visiting more frequently, bringing 3-year-old Grace to fill the house with the laughter it had lacked for so long. But she worried about Sarah's emotional state. "Mom just sits in Dad's office sometimes," Emma confided to Jake during one of their weekly phone calls. "She's finally started going through his things, but I don't think she knows what to do with herself. The search for Dad was her job, her identity. Without it, I think she feels lost." Jake, who had returned to his prosecutor's job with renewed dedication to cases involving military veterans, understood his mother's struggle better than most. She spent 13 years postponing her grief, he told Emma. Now she has to feel everything she's been holding back, and she has to do it without the hope that sustained her. That's going to take time. Sophie, now in her senior year at Virginia Tech, had chosen to write her psychology thesis on the long-term effects of ambiguous loss on family systems. Her research, partially inspired by her own family's experience, had led her to understand that their journey was far from over. Ambiguous loss is when you can't grieve properly because you don't know if the person is dead or alive, she explained to her advisor, Dr. Patricia Williams. But what we experienced might be even more complex. We had 13 years to adjust to Dad being gone, but we never had permission to let go completely. Now that we know the truth, we have to learn how to grieve properly, but we're also grieving the lost time and the false hope we carried for so long. The Mitchell family's story had attracted the attention of Dr. Samantha Reed, a researcher at Johns Hopkins who specialized in family trauma and recovery. Dr. Reed reached out to Sarah in February 2020, requesting permission to document their experience as part of a longitudinal study on families affected by unsolved murders. Your family's case is unique because you had such a lengthy period of ambiguous loss followed by such a complete resolution, Dr. Reed explained during their first interview. Most families either never learn what happened to their loved one or they learn the truth much sooner. Your 13-year journey, followed by Bradley's full confession, provides an unusual window into how families process extended trauma and sudden closure. Through these sessions with Dr. Reed, Sarah began to understand that her struggle to adjust to life after truth was not unusual or unhealthy. Many families who finally receive answers after years of uncertainty experience a phenomenon that researchers call closure grief, the paradoxical sadness that comes with getting what you thought you wanted most. I know this sounds terrible, Sarah admitted during one session, but sometimes I miss not knowing. When Paul was just missing, I could imagine that he might be alive somewhere, maybe with amnesia or held captive but still breathing. Now I know that he died violently on November 15, 2006, and I can never unknow that. Dr. Reed nodded with understanding. That's not terrible, Sarah. That's human. Hope, even painful hope, can be easier to bear than finality. You're not just grieving Paul's death, you're grieving the loss of the possibility that he might still be alive. As 2020 progressed, Sarah slowly began to rebuild her identity around something other than searching for her missing husband. She started volunteering with the National Center for Missing Adults, helping other families navigate the bureaucracy and emotional complexity of missing person cases. Her first client was Maria Santos, whose brother had disappeared from a construction site in Baltimore 3 years earlier. The police stopped returning my calls after 6 months, Maria told Sarah during their first meeting. They say adults have the right to disappear, but Miguel would never leave his kids. Something happened to him and nobody seems to care. Sarah recognized the desperation in Maria's voice, the same desperate certainty she had carried for 13 years. For the first time since Bradley's arrest, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that wasn't rooted in her own loss. I believe you, Sarah said simply, and I'm going to help you make sure Miguel's case doesn't get forgotten. Working with other families gave Sarah a way to honor Paul's memory while channeling her investigative skills and emotional resilience into something constructive. She quickly became known among missing person advocates as someone who could navigate police departments, file Freedom of Information Act requests, and coordinate media campaigns with the expertise of a seasoned detective. But it was her work with military families that became her greatest passion. Sarah discovered that veterans were disproportionately represented among missing persons, often disappearing during mental health crises or periods of severe PTSD. Many of these cases, like Paul's, involved complicated family dynamics and insufficient support systems. In September 2020, Sarah received a call that would define the next phase of her life. Colonel Jennifer Martinez, no relation to Detective Martinez, from the Pentagon's Family Readiness Group, had seen Sarah's advocacy work and wanted to discuss a partnership. "We're seeing an increase in missing veteran cases," Colonel Martinez explained. "Soldiers who come home from deployment and then vanish, sometimes permanently. We think your experience, combined with your investigative skills and your understanding of military culture, could help us develop better protocols for these situations." The collaboration led to the creation of the Paul Mitchell Family Support Initiative, a Pentagon program designed to provide immediate, comprehensive assistance to military families dealing with missing service members. The program addressed gaps in communication, coordination between military and civilian law enforcement, and family support services that had contributed to the Mitchell family's 13-year ordeal. Emma, watching her mother transform her tragedy into a tool for helping others, felt a complex mixture of pride and concern. "I'm proud of what Mom is doing," she told Jake, "but I worry that she's avoiding processing her own grief by focusing so much on other people's problems." Jake, who had been attending therapy to deal with his own complex feelings about his father's murder, disagreed. "I think this is exactly what Mom needs," he said. "She's not running from her grief. She's making sure Paul's death means something. She's making sure other families don't have to wait 13 years for answers." Sophie, now preparing for graduate school in forensic psychology, saw her mother's work as a form of what therapists call meaning-making, the process of finding purpose and significance in traumatic experiences. "Mom is creating a living memorial to Dad," Sophie observed during a family dinner on Paul's birthday in March 2021. "Every family she helps, every case that gets solved because of the initiative, that's Dad's legacy continuing to grow." As the second anniversary of Bradley's sentencing approached, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that October day in 2019. The sharp edges of her grief had not disappeared, but they had been worn smooth by time and purpose. She still missed Paul every day, still felt the phantom ache of his absence during family gatherings and quiet moments, but she had learned to carry her love for him as a source of strength rather than just sorrow. The most profound change was in her relationship with the concept of justice. For 13 years, Sarah had believed that learning the truth about Paul's disappearance would provide closure and peace. Instead, she had discovered that justice was not a destination, but an ongoing process, something that required constant effort to achieve and maintain. "I used to think that getting answers about Paul would be the end of our story," Sarah told Dr. Reed during their final interview. "Now I understand that it was just the beginning of a different chapter." By 2022, the Paul Mitchell case had become more than a true crime story. It had evolved into a catalyst for systemic change in how law enforcement, the military, and support organizations handle missing veteran cases. The ripple effects of Paul's murder and the Mitchell family's 13-year ordeal were being felt across multiple institutions, creating reforms that might prevent other families from enduring similar tragedies. The most significant change came from the Department of Defense, which had conducted a comprehensive review of its protocols for handling missing military personnel and their families. The review, initiated partly in response to congressional hearings that featured Sarah's testimony, revealed shocking gaps in coordination between military and civilian authorities when active duty or recently discharged service members disappeared. General Patricia Williams, the Pentagon's new Director of Family Services, had worked closely with Sarah to develop what became known as the Mitchell Protocol, a set of mandatory procedures for handling missing veteran cases. The protocol required immediate notification of multiple agencies, mandatory mental health screenings for all personnel involved in the search, and the assignment of a dedicated family liaison officer to ensure consistent communication. Before the Mitchell Protocol, families like Sarah's could fall through the cracks because nobody wanted to take responsibility for cases that crossed jurisdictional lines, General Williams explained to a Senate subcommittee on veteran affairs. "Now we have clear chains of command and accountability that prevent cases from being forgotten or mishandled." The protocol had already proven effective. In its first 18 months of implementation, it had led to the resolution of 12 missing veteran cases that had previously been classified as cold. More importantly, it had provided consistent support to 43 families who were dealing with missing service members, ensuring that they received regular updates and access to resources rather than being left to navigate the system alone. Detective Sarah Martinez, now Captain Martinez and head of Arlington's Cold Case Division, had become a national expert on long-term missing person investigations. She frequently consulted on cases across the country and had developed training programs that emphasized the importance of maintaining family communication and pursuing new leads even years after initial investigations had stalled. The Mitchell case taught us that families often have insights and information that investigators miss, Captain Martinez told a conference of law enforcement professionals in Chicago. Sarah Mitchell's persistence and advocacy were crucial to keeping Paul's case active in our minds, even when official resources had moved elsewhere. We've learned to view families as partners in investigations rather than just victims who need to be managed. The changes weren't limited to government agencies. The case had also inspired reforms in how mental health professionals worked with military families. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Thomas Bradley, had established a research center focused on the intersection of military trauma, family systems, and violent crime. The Bradley-Mitchell case illustrates how untreated trauma can create multiple generations of victims, Dr. Foster explained in her groundbreaking paper, Secondary Trauma in Military Families, The Long-Term Effects of Ambiguous Loss. Paul Mitchell's children grew up with the trauma of not knowing what happened to their father, while Thomas Bradley's family lived with the secondary trauma of his untreated PTSD and eventual violent breakdown. Sophie Mitchell, now a graduate student in forensic psychology working under Dr. Foster's supervision, had become a researcher in her own right, studying how families recover from extended periods of ambiguous loss. Her work, which drew heavily on her own family's experience, was helping to develop better therapeutic interventions for families dealing with missing loved ones. Traditional grief counseling doesn't work when you don't know if your loved one is dead or alive, Sophie explained during her first academic conference presentation. Families need specialized support that acknowledges the unique psychological challenges of ambiguous loss while still helping them maintain hope and function in their daily lives. Emma, meanwhile, had channeled her experience into advocacy work focused on children affected by missing parent cases. As the mother of 2 young children herself, she understood intimately how Paul's disappearance had shaped her own childhood and adolescent development. Children of missing parents face unique challenges that are often overlooked by support systems focused on the spouse or adult family members, Emma testified before a House subcommittee on missing persons. We grew up in a household defined by uncertainty, hope and grief that couldn't be properly expressed or resolved. That kind of emotional environment has lasting effects that need to be acknowledged and addressed. Emma's advocacy had led to the creation of specialized support groups for children and teenagers dealing with missing parent cases, as well as training programs for school counselors and teachers who might encounter these students. Jake's perspective as both a survivor and a prosecutor had made him a sought-after expert on the legal complexities of cold cases involving military personnel. He had left his job in the D.C. prosecutor's office to join the Department of Justice's Cold Case Initiative, where he specialized in cases involving veterans and military families. The military justice system and civilian law enforcement often have different priorities and procedures, Jake explained during a legal symposium on cold cases. When a case like my father's crosses both systems, coordination failures can leave families without adequate support or investigation. We've learned to build bridges between these systems to ensure that cases don't fall through bureaucratic cracks. But perhaps the most significant change inspired by the Mitchell case was in how society discussed and addressed veteran mental health. Thomas Bradley's descent from decorated combat veteran to murderer had sparked national conversations about the long-term effects of military service and the adequacy of support systems for returning soldiers. The Thomas Bradley case study, as it became known in academic circles, was being used in medical schools, social work programs, and veteran service organizations as an example of how untreated trauma could escalate into violence if not properly addressed. Bradley himself, serving his life sentence at Red Onion State Prison in Virginia, had agreed to participate in research studies aimed at understanding the progression from combat trauma to violent crime. Dr. Michael Chen, a psychiatrist at the VA Medical Center who had interviewed Bradley extensively, found that his case illustrated several warning signs that mental health professionals had learned to recognize and address more effectively. Bradley exhibited classic symptoms of moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when someone participates in or witnesses acts that violate their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong, Dr. Chen explained. In combat, soldiers sometimes have to make life and death decisions that save their comrades but cause lasting psychological wounds. Without proper treatment, these wounds can fester and lead to the kind of explosive violence we saw in Paul Mitchell's murder. The VA had used Bradley's case to develop new screening protocols for combat veterans, particularly those who had been involved in life-or-death situations during deployment. Early intervention programs had been expanded, and peer support networks had been strengthened to ensure that veterans like Bradley received help before their trauma escalated to dangerous levels. Sarah, reflecting on these systemic changes during a 2022 interview with 60 Minutes, expressed mixed feelings about her husband's legacy. "I'm proud that Paul's death has led to changes that might save other families from going through what we experienced," she said. "But I would trade all of these improvements to have my husband back, to have Thomas Bradley get the help he needed before he decided that murder was his solution. Progress built on tragedy always feels bittersweet." The interview, which aired on the 6th anniversary of Paul's body being discovered, included segments with all three Mitchell children discussing how their father's murder and their family's long ordeal had shaped their adult lives and career choices. "In a strange way, losing Dad the way we did gave all of us a sense of purpose," Emma reflected. "We've all chosen careers and advocacy work that try to prevent other families from experiencing what we went through. That doesn't make up for losing him, but it makes his death mean something beyond just our personal tragedy." As 2023 approached, marking 17 years since Paul's disappearance and 4 years since the resolution of his case, the Mitchell family continued to grapple with questions of legacy, justice, and healing. They had transformed their private tragedy into public advocacy, but the personal work of processing grief and rebuilding their lives remained an ongoing challenge. The final chapter of their story would not be about achieving perfect closure or complete healing. Such things, they had learned, were myths that well-meaning people told themselves about trauma and recovery. Instead, it would be about finding ways to honor Paul's memory while building lives that were meaningful and purposeful, despite the permanent hole his absence had left in their world. Spring 2025. 18.5 years have passed since Paul Mitchell walked out of the Pentagon for the last time, and 6 years since his family finally learned the truth about his disappearance. The cherry blossoms are blooming around the tidal basin in Washington, D.C., just as they did in April 2006, when Paul was still coming home every evening to help with homework and coach Little League games. Sarah Mitchell, now 53, stands before his grave in Arlington National Cemetery, holding the hand of her 4-year-old granddaughter, Lily, Emma's youngest child, who was born in 2021 and named after the lily of the valley flowers that Paul used to bring Sarah every Mother's Day. Lily has never met her grandfather, but she knows his stories, sees his photograph on the mantelpiece, and understands that Grandma Sarah talks to him sometimes when she thinks no one is listening. "Tell me again about Grandpa Paul," Lily says, her small voice carrying the matter-of-fact curiosity that children bring to concepts adults find unbearably complex. Sarah kneels beside Paul's headstone, its granite surface warm from the April sun, and begins the ritual that has become both a family tradition and a form of therapy. Grandpa Paul was a soldier who protected people, and a daddy who loved his children more than anything in the whole world. He had to go away before you were born, but he would have loved you so much, Lily. He would have read you stories and pushed you on the swing and taught you how to throw a baseball, just like he did with your mom and uncles. The Paul Mitchell Family Support Initiative, now in its 5th year, has helped resolve 47 missing veteran cases and provided support to more than 300 military families. Sarah serves as its civilian director, splitting her time between Washington, D.C. and speaking engagements across the country. Her work has taken her to military bases, police departments, and congressional hearings, but she always returns to Arlington on Paul's birthday, their wedding anniversary, and the anniversary of his disappearance. Emma, now 35, has become one of the nation's leading advocates for children affected by missing parent cases. Her non-profit organization, Missing Pieces, operates support programs in 12 states and has trained over 1,000 school counselors and teachers to recognize and assist children dealing with ambiguous loss. She often brings her 3 children, Grace, 8, Michael, 6, and Lily, 4, to visit their grandfather's grave, continuing the stories and memories that keep Paul's presence alive for a new generation. "The kids know that Grandpa Paul was murdered, but we talk about it in age-appropriate ways," Emma explains. "We focus on his life, his service, his love for our family. They understand that bad things sometimes happen to good people, but they also understand that we choose how to respond to tragedy." Jake, 32, has risen through the ranks of the Department of Justice's Cold Case Initiative and now leads a specialized unit focused on missing veteran cases. His team has achieved a 60% resolution rate for cases that had been dormant for more than 5 years, a dramatic improvement from the historical 15% resolution rate for such cases. He credits much of this success to protocols and procedures developed from lessons learned during his father's case. Every time we reunite a family with answers about their missing loved one, I think about Mom sitting by the phone for 13 years, waiting for someone to call her with news about Dad, Jake says. We can't bring back the people who are gone, but we can spare other families the agony of not knowing. Sophie, 27, completed her PhD in forensic psychology in 2024 and now works as a researcher and clinician specializing in trauma recovery for military families. Her doctoral dissertation, Ambiguous Loss and Post-Traumatic Growth in Families of Missing Veterans, has become required reading in graduate programs across the country. She divides her time between treating families dealing with missing loved ones and conducting research that informs policy and practice. I used to think that Dad's murder was the worst thing that could happen to our family, Sophie reflects. But I've learned that trauma can be a catalyst for growth and purpose if you have the support and resources to process it healthily. We were fortunate to have each other and eventually to have the truth. Not every family gets both of those things. Thomas Bradley, now 62, remains in Red Onion State Prison, where he has become an unlikely advocate for veteran mental health services. He participates in research studies, mentors younger inmates dealing with combat trauma, and has written letters to veterans organizations warning about the dangers of untreated PTSD. His transformation from murderer to advocate doesn't excuse his crime, but it has contributed to research that has helped other veterans avoid his path. I can never undo what I did to Paul or to his family, Bradley wrote in a letter to Sarah on the 10th anniversary of his confession, but I can try to make sure that other veterans get the help I was too proud and too stupid to seek. If my story prevents even one family from going through what I put you through, then maybe Paul's death and my imprisonment will have served some purpose beyond just punishment. Sarah has never responded to Bradley's letters, but she hasn't thrown them away either. They remain in a box in her closet, alongside the newspaper clippings that documented her 13-year search and the condolence cards that poured in after Paul's funeral. She's not ready to forgive his killer, and she may never be, but she's found peace with the complexity of that relationship. Thomas Bradley destroyed our family, but he also gave us a new purpose. Sarah told a group of military spouses during a recent speaking engagement, I don't forgive him for murdering Paul, but I'm grateful that his confession allowed us to finally bury our husband and father with dignity. Grief is complicated, and healing isn't always about forgiveness. The Mitchell family's story has been featured in documentaries, academic papers, and congressional testimony, but they've tried to maintain perspective about their role as public figures. They understand that their tragedy resonated with people because it illustrated larger failures in how society supports military families and handles missing person cases, but they also recognize the importance of maintaining their privacy and protecting their emotional well-being. We share our story because it helps other people, but we don't live in our story, Emma explains. We have jobs and relationships and daily life challenges that have nothing to do with Dad's murder or the missing years. The tragedy shaped us, but it doesn't define us. As the sun sets over Arlington National Cemetery on this April evening in 2025, Sarah places a small American flag beside Paul's headstone, a ritual she began after his funeral and has continued every month since. Lily helps her arrange the lily of the valley flowers they brought from Sarah's garden, the same variety Paul used to bring for Mother's Day. Will Grandpa Paul ever come back? Lily asks, displaying the direct curiosity that adults have learned to avoid. No, sweetheart, Sarah says gently. Grandpa Paul is gone forever, but the love he had for our family and the love we have for him, that never goes away. That's what keeps him alive in our hearts. As they walk back toward the car, Sarah's phone buzzes with a text message from Captain Martinez. Sarah, we just found Jennifer Walsh. She's alive and safe. Your advocacy helped her family never give up. Thank you. Jennifer Walsh had disappeared from Fort Bragg 8 months earlier, and Sarah had worked closely with her family to ensure that proper protocols were followed and that the case received adequate attention. Unlike Paul's story, Jennifer's had a happy ending. She had been suffering from a psychological break following deployment trauma, but she had been found safe at a homeless shelter in North Carolina and was now receiving treatment. Sarah shows the message to Emma, who smiles through tears. Dad would be proud of what you're doing, Mum. I hope so, Sarah says. I really hope so. The Mitchell family drives home through the Virginia suburbs, where Paul disappeared 18.5 years ago, past the Pentagon where he worked, past the neighborhood where Thomas Bradley lived while carrying the secret of his crime, past the construction site where Paul's body was finally discovered. These places no longer hold terror for them. They've become part of a story that includes tragedy, but doesn't end with it. At home, Sarah opens Paul's desk drawer and pulls out the wedding ring that was found with his remains. The inscription is still barely visible. Forever yours, SM. She slips it onto her finger, something she started doing on special occasions after his funeral, and speaks aloud to the photograph on his desk. I kept my promise, Paul. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped loving you. And I never will. Outside, spring continues its eternal cycle of renewal. Cherry blossoms fall like snow on Arlington's quiet streets, and somewhere another military family sits down to dinner with an empty chair at the table, not yet knowing that their loved one will never come home, but not yet ready to stop hoping that he will. The search for the missing continues, but because of Paul Mitchell's story and his family's refusal to let his disappearance be forgotten, fewer families will have to search alone. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Paul Mitchell's story. See you in the next video.